Good day, friends, and brother Rob with you again. So, I don't know why I hesitated. It's almost like us. Am I Rob? Am I brother Rob? Anyways, caffeine's still kicking in. So, and it's early morning here. It's about 3:30 in the morning in Eastern Standard Time. Yeah, I know. Sometimes my internal alarm clock's a bit off. So, anyways. That being said, what I want to talk about in this particular video is why macroevolution is not only not scientific, it's anti-science. It's actually in the realm of science fiction. So let's go through a few things, okay? One of the most common misconceptions for the theory of macroevolution is that commonalities among different species in the genetic structure prove common ancestry. No, that's not true. Let me give you, by way of analogy, how you'd never use this example in any other, as an example for proof of such a thing in any other field of study observation. Okay, so for example, let's say I have, let me think. Okay, let's say I have two mountain bikes. They're both 10 speeds. But let's say one has a wider gear shift than the other, and let's say one is created by they're created by different companies. So they're created by competitors. They're created with different spaces and gear shift, and let's say one has a bell, one has a horn, one has a kickstand, and one doesn't have a kickstand. So the only commonality you have in that example of the bikes, is that they're both 10 speeds. But to say that it proves that not common ancestry, but to say that they're the same thing across the board because they're both 10 speeds is a faulty and fallacious way of thinking. And you would agree with that if you're a rational, logical thinking person. So let's apply the same thing to evolution. So let's say, for example, I think it's, I think chimpanzees and human beings have around 90% or so commonality in our genetic structure in terms of our DNA. So we share 90% DNA commonalities with chimpanzees, to my knowledge. Now, I'm obviously, if you look at a human, you look at a chimp, you can see obvious similarities in bone structure, cheekbones, facial structure. So there's you can see a lot of commonalities between humans and chimpanzees, and I don't dispute that. Which is, you're obviously, if you have a 90% commonality in the DNA in your genetic structure, in your genetic code, then obviously you're going to see striking resemblances to a degree, to a large degree, obviously, 90%. But here's the thing. First of all, it still doesn't prove a common ancestor, and secondly, that 10% makes up a big difference in who we are as two different species in the natural world. A chimpanzee does not know how to drive. A chimpanzee does not know how to pick up a hammer and drive it in a nail. A chimpanzee doesn't know how to do philosophy. A chimpanzee doesn't know that it's wrong to kill somebody unprovoked. A chimpanzee doesn't know how to type. Chimpanzee doesn't know how to spar. Well, I shouldn't say they don't know how to spar. Maybe some of them. Actually, they're pretty tough creatures, so maybe I'll retract that. Maybe they can't spar. Okay, but let's say they can't adapt to the sparring training like as myself as a martial artist can and does. So they can fight, but let's say that they're not adapting for the most part to a fight should they be engaged in one. They're just going by pure instinct. Okay, so another thing obviously is they don't have courts of justice. So if a chimpanzee was to kill another chimpanzee, you don't get a bunch of other chimps obviously dragging that guy into court and say, okay, why'd you do this? And obviously, another difference is language. I'm not saying animals can't communicate, and maybe there is a language that animals actually. I would have to agree. I would have to assume that animals have their own language for. I mean, the sounds they make, which are gibberish to us, may be a language to them, because even in human languages, there are languages that sound gibberish to me that obviously make sense to the speakers of those particular languages. So I think it probably works the same way in the animal kingdom. A meow to a cat could mean something to a cat that we don't understand. I mean, some are obvious, and and cats are pretty good at letting us know what they're talking about when they're meowing or dog barking, or so on and so forth. So most animals are good at nonverbal communication to some degree or another. So there's large differences, of course, in that 5 or whatever percentage that we diverge. I'm not talking about divergence speciations. I'm talking about where we diverge as. I guess I am and I'm not, but I'm not saying it as divergent speciation in the way that macroevolution is espousing. Okay, so where chimps and humans diverge in terms of where the commonalities lie and differ. That's the divergence. That's where the divergence I'm talking about. Okay, is the things that I've already mentioned. Okay, so again, my first point: commonalities among genetic structures among different species do not prove a common ancestor. All they prove is just that commonalities. Second point of contention is that evolution is more or less a time plus matter equals magic. So here we go again. That say, for example, if you they will propose that given enough time, low life form starting bacterias eventually evolved, and and they had single cellular reproduction. So, but here's there again, that logically doesn't make sense. So how can a single cell reproduce? You need at least 2 to make it work. Where do the cells come from, and how do the cells arise? There's so many questions that macroevolution will not, and does not answer. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that well, I can't say for the sake of, because I can't allow it logistically. I mean, I can't allow it logically or rationally. That first of all, a single cell can't reproduce on its own, and no matter how much time given, you're never going to get from a single-celled organism to the complex creatures that we see today as human beings. Actually, I would go as far as to say is you can give it an eternity of time, and you'll never have that happen. Ever. And you would say, how do I know that? Because it's logically absurd and scientifically impossible. See, and the other thing is, and the reason that I can't, I'm going to tackle this one issue at a time. So for example, we can't get lower life forms don't become more complex as they go on. Now you might say, well, what about, you can maybe use it analogously and say, well, what about when I'm in the womb from the time I conceived to the time to right now, 42, almost 43 years later. Obviously, there's been growth and development, monstrous growth and development in my cellular reproduction since the time I was conceived to now, at almost 43 years of age. But here's the thing. All the information for me was there at the moment of conception. So I didn't arise, and my DNA was built upon sperm and egg from my mom and my dad, and that is biologically sound, and no one in their right mind would refute that. So, but that's not an argument for macroevolution. that's an argument for actually my side, young Earth creation, where Jesus, well, yeah, it's Jesus because Jesus is God. So, so that in that everything produces after what? Its own kind. So we see everything producing after its own kind. Now, granted, of course, yes, microevolution is definitely scientific, which microevolution, to put it in layman plain terms, just means adaptation and changes within the species. So you could take a black man and a white woman, and they can mate, and they can and their offspring will resemble something resembling a combination of the whiteness of the lady and the blackness of the man. But that's still, but so that you have change and adaptation within reproduction. But that doesn't prove anything other than that. I mean, that's just, this is no one in the right mind would say that's not scientific. But my contention is not with microevolution, but with macroevolution. Now, a lot of people will say, well, what macroevolution is just lots of microevolutions. But the thing is, that doesn't work because, one is, again, microevolution is demonstrably observable, testable, repeatable, whereas macroevolution isn't. So you have the one, but you don't have the other. But what evolutionists like to do is conflate the two. What they do is they play bait and switch, which is a clever game of idiocy in my mind, but it usually fools the average person because, well, to be entirely forthright, the average person isn't that critical in their thinking, and they don't see that someone's just pulled the rug out from under their feet ideologically, logically, and scientifically, and they don't even realize it. So the whole thing, it doesn't work. So it's like saying humans always produce humans, regardless, you could have, again, different spectrums of colors of your skin, but you could always have the human. So that's adaptation. But the thing is, you don't have chimps becoming, you have chimps becoming humans, you don't have humans becoming something else. So that's where the whole argument falls apart. Now, of course, the proponents of evolution will say that because of, the commonality of the gene structure between chimps and humans, that we must have a common ancestor. But again, that is a category error. That's reading the conclusion from the premises. It's circular reasoning, begging the question as well. So my contention is that the commonalities that we see don't whatsoever infer a common ancestor. What they infer is a common designer. So God didn't see fit to borrow the expression reinvent the wheel. It just means he didn't see it necessary to make different species with drastically genetic structures across the board for every single time he decided to create a creature and species. He didn't think he needed to reinvent the wheel. No, I can't make it more simple than that. Okay, and then of course, there's the other one I have. There's another contention I have to deal with here. So, limitations. Limitations within the genetic, within the gene pool of each. Within the limitations in the gene pool of each species that prevents macroevolution from ever happening. So, again, I'm obviously a human being, and I'm a man. You can disagree with that all you want, but biologically speaking, I'm a man. If you want to dispute that, otherwise, I don't really care. I'm unbothered by your unfounded and unfettered opinions of me as a man. Okay, so limitations in gene pool of each species prevent macroevolution from happening. Now, if macroevolution were possible, then it would be possible for chimps and humans to mate and reproduce, or chimps and monkeys to mate and reproduce, or actually that may be possible. That one I'm not sure. But for example, but at the very least, if macroevolution was true, you would think that chimps and humans should be able to mate and reproduce. Now, don't hear me clearly. I'm not suggesting whatsoever. I'm not proposing bestiality. I'm not supposing that we do try to mate with a chimpanzee. I think that would be demonstrably disgusting, perverse, and just beyond bizarre. But anyways, so so hear me clearly. I'm not proposing bestiality, but I'm just saying, for the sake of hypothetical argument, that if humans and apes were that strong in our relationship to each other genetically, then why can't we reproduce? Or why don't we even think to reproduce? Because it defies reality. It defies common sense. It defies biology. Why would we go with someone where 90% or so linked with reproductively when we could go with someone 100% we're linked with reproductively and biologically, right? So obviously, that's probably the rebuttal I'm going to get, the pushback I'm going to get for that. But anyways, that's kind of neither here nor there for the sake of the argument. But just limitations in the gene pool prevent it. So, for example, the genes of a human being prevent any other thing other than a human being producing. See, a human being can only produce a human being. It can't. There's the limitations in the genetic structure of a human being prevent it from ever reproducing anything else than a human being. And no matter how much time you give, there's never going to be a divergent speciation that human beings become something else. So this whole idea of macroevolution is a bunch of microevolutions is just abject nonsense. It just doesn't work. Microevolution is just continuously scientific. It's observable, testable, repeatable, whereas macroevolution is not scientific. Not only is it not scientific, it's anti-scientific. So it can't happen. So again, genetic limitations of the gene pool of each species prevent macroevolution and or divergent speciation. Commonalities do not prove common ancestry, they prove common designer, also known as God. And so I had another point. Think. And no matter how much time you give, life will never be able to go from single-celled organisms to the complex creatures we know and see as us today, and on a genetic scale. It just, no matter how much time you give it, it just doesn't work. So again, 3 reasons simply laid out in this video why macroevolution doesn't work. One is commonalities in the genetic structure of different species, even something like the commonalities between a human and a chimp, which is about 90-something% in similarity, and you can see that just by looking at a chimp, that you can see obvious similarities. But again, the similarities in the gene code do not prove a common ancestor, they prove a common designer. Secondly, no matter how much time you give, you're never gonna get lower life forms producing on their own. That's another absurd. But I'm not tackling abiogenesis today, or this video, I should say. So no matter how much time you give it, it's never gonna happen. It hasn't happened. And so it hasn't been tested, it hasn't been observed, tested, or repeated. So by the scrutiny of what the scientific method, what's considered scientific, it fails the scrutiny of meeting the measures of scientific inquiry and observation because it's not observable. So therefore, we can rule it out as scientific. And finally, last but not least, the limitations in the gene pool of each species prevent divergent speciation and or macroevolution from ever occurring past, present, and future. And that's it for now. Peace out, Brother Rob.